The blood on Clara Colton's hands wasn't hers, but she had scrubbed them raw, trying to convince the marshal otherwise when he found her standing over her stepfather's body in the summer of 1882. She hadn't spoken a word since that August night, not to explain, not to defend herself, not even to scream when they locked her in that cold cell in Quartz Hill, California. Her silence had become her prison long before iron bars ever were, because the truth she carried would destroy the only family she had left, and some burdens felt lighter when borne alone. The marshal had released her 3 days later when her younger half-brother Thomas swore on a Bible that their father had come home drunk and violent, that he'd fallen and cracked his skull on the stone hearth all on his own, that Clara had only tried to help him. It was a lie, but Clara held her tongue and let it stand, because the real story would have put a noose around her brother's neck, and she loved him too much to let him hang for finally fighting back against the man who had brutalized them both for years. 6 months had passed since that night, and Clara still hadn't uttered a single word. The townspeople of Quartz Hill whispered about her in the general store and turned away when she walked down the dusty main street. They called her touched in the head, cursed by grief, or worse. The ranch her stepfather had left behind was falling apart without a man to run it, and her brother Thomas, barely 19 and wild with newfound freedom, spent more time drinking in the saloon than mending fences. Clara worked herself to exhaustion every day, feeding livestock, hauling water from the well, trying to hold together a life that had already shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had learned that silence was safer than truth, that keeping secrets was easier than watching the people you loved face consequences they couldn't survive. The winter had been harsh in the high desert, and spring came late to Quartz Hill. Clara was in town on a Tuesday morning in March, trading eggs for flour at Morrison's General Store when she first saw Ethan Pierce. He stood tall beside a dusty black horse, his hat pulled low against the bright California sun, wearing the weathered look of a man who had spent years in the saddle. He was maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains. He was talking to Marshal Hendricks outside the jailhouse, his voice too low for Clara to hear, but something about the set of his shoulders suggested a quiet confidence that made her pause with her basket of goods. Ethan Pierce had come to Quartz Hill looking for honest work after 2 years of driving cattle up from Texas. He was tired of the trail, tired of sleeping on hard ground and eating dust, and he'd heard that the mining operations in the hills needed men who could handle horses and weren't afraid of long hours. The marshal had told him about a few ranches that might need a hired hand, including the Colton place, though Hendricks had added with a meaningful look that the situation there was complicated. Ethan had learned not to pry into other people's business, so he'd just nodded and asked for directions. Clara was leaving the general store when Ethan tipped his hat to her on the wooden sidewalk. She met his eyes for just a moment, and something in his gaze was different from the way other men in town looked at her. There was no judgment there, no curiosity about her strangeness, just a simple acknowledgement of one human being to another. She felt her cheeks warm, and she quickly looked down at her boots as she hurried past him toward where she'd tied her mule to the hitching post. That afternoon, Ethan rode out to the Colton ranch. The property sat in a valley between brown hills, dotted with Joshua trees and scrub brush, about 4 miles from the center of town. The house was adobe, with a red tile roof, modest but sturdy, and the outbuildings showed signs of neglect. Fences sagged, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and a windmill creaked and groaned in the breeze. A young man with sandy hair was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood, with more attention to a whiskey bottle beside him than to his work. "Afternoon," Ethan called out, staying mounted until he was invited down. "Name's Ethan Pierce. Marshall said you could use some help around here." Thomas Colton looked up with bloodshot eyes and shrugged. "I suppose we could. Don't have much money for wages, though." "Room and board plus a small wage would suit me fine," Ethan said. "I'm good with horses and cattle, can fix most anything that's broken, and I don't mind hard work." Thomas stood up, swaying slightly. "You'd have to talk to my sister. She handles the money." "Clara!" He turned toward the house and shouted, Clara, come on out here. The door opened slowly, and the young woman Ethan had seen in town stepped onto the porch. She wore a simple brown dress with an apron, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that fell over one shoulder. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, regarded him with caution. She didn't say anything, just stood there with her hands clasped in front of her. "This fellow wants to hire on," Thomas said. "What do you think?" Clara looked at Ethan for a long moment, then at the ranch around them, at all the work that needed doing. She nodded once, slowly. "Is that a yes?" Ethan asked gently, directing his question to her rather than to her brother. She nodded again. "She don't talk," Thomas said flatly. "Hasn't said a word since our PA died, but she understands everything just fine. She'll write things down if she needs to tell you something important." Ethan felt a tug of curiosity, but kept his expression neutral. "That's fine by me. When would you like me to start?" Clara held up one finger, then pointed at the ground. "Today, I reckon," Thomas translated with a laugh. "There's a room in the barn that's been used for hired hands before. It's not much, but it's dry and has a stove." Ethan dismounted and extended his hand to Thomas, who shook it with a weak grip, then turned to Clara. "Miss Colton, I appreciate the opportunity. I'll do right by you and earn my keep." She met his eyes again, and this time she held his gaze for a few heartbeats longer. Something flickered in her expression, a mixture of relief and wariness, before she nodded and turned back into the house. Over the next few weeks, Ethan settled into the rhythm of ranch work. He repaired fences, patched the barn roof, and got the windmill working properly again. He discovered that Clara was up before dawn every morning, tending to the chickens and the milk cow, working in the vegetable garden she'd started behind the house. She moved through her tasks with determined efficiency, never complaining, never resting until the work was done. Thomas, by contrast, disappeared for days at a time, coming home drunk and surly, contributing nothing. Ethan found himself watching Clara more than he probably should. She had a quiet strength about her, a resilience that spoke of hardship endured and survived. She communicated through gestures and expressions, and he learned to read her signals. When she pointed at something that needed repair, he fixed it. When she brought him coffee in the morning and fresh bread with his dinner, he thanked her, even though she never responded with words. But he saw the slight softening of her features, the tiniest hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth, and those small acknowledgments became something he looked forward to each day. One evening in late April, Ethan was finishing up in the barn when he heard raised voices from the house. Thomas had come home drunk again, and through the open window, Ethan could hear him shouting, "You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Walking around here like some kind of saint. You couldn't even speak up for yourself when they thought you killed him. You're pathetic." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay where he was. This was family business, not his concern. Then he heard the sound of something breaking, glass shattering, and a moment later Clara came running out of the house. Even in the fading light, he could see tears streaming down her face. She ran toward the horse corral, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He gave her a few minutes, then walked slowly in her direction. She was standing at the fence rail, gripping it with white-knuckled hands, her whole body trembling. Ethan stopped a few feet away, giving her space but making his presence known. "Miss Colton," he said quietly, "are you all right?" She didn't turn around, but she shook her head. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head again, more vigorously this time. Ethan moved closer, close enough that he could speak softly. "I don't know what happened in your past, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I want you to know something. You're not pathetic. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. The way you keep this place running, the way you face each day, that takes more courage than most folks ever have to muster." Clara turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see her profile. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, catching the last rays of sunlight. Her lips moved as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. The frustration and pain on her face cut right through him. "It's all right," he said. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." She turned to face him fully then, and the look in her eyes was so raw and grateful and desperate that Ethan felt his heart clench in his chest. Without thinking, he took a step closer and held out his hand, palm up, an offering. Clara stared at his hand for a long moment, then slowly placed her smaller hand in his. Her fingers were rough from work, cold from the evening air. Ethan gently closed his hand around hers and gave a reassuring squeeze. They stood like that as darkness settled over the valley, not speaking, just holding on to each other in the quiet. For Clara, it was the first time since that terrible August night that anyone had touched her with simple kindness, with no expectations or demands. For Ethan, it was the moment he realized his feelings for this silent woman had grown into something deeper than admiration or respect. Eventually, Clara gently withdrew her hand and wiped her face with her apron. She looked toward the house where lamplight now glowed in the windows, then back at Ethan. She pressed her hand to her heart, then extended it toward him, a gesture he understood as thank you. "Any time," he said. "I mean that." She nodded and walked back toward the house with her head held higher than when she'd run out. Ethan watched her go, then returned to his room in the barn, where he lay awake for a long time thinking about green eyes and silent strength and the way her hand had felt in his. The next morning, Thomas was gone again, leaving only a terse note saying he'd be away for a while. Clara found the note on the kitchen table and crumpled it in her fist. Ethan saw her standing in the doorway, staring out at the empty yard, and recognized the set of her shoulders. She was alone again, left to manage everything by herself. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Clara fell into an easy partnership. They worked side by side, repairing what had been neglected, bringing the ranch back to life. He would gesture to ask if she wanted help with something, and she would nod or shake her head. She started leaving little things for him: a slice of apple pie wrapped in cloth, his shirts mended and folded on his doorstep, wildflowers in a jar outside the barn. He responded by taking on the heaviest work, chopping extra firewood, fixing the loose boards on the porch, anything to lighten her burden. They developed their own language of glances and small gestures. When he made her laugh with a story about a stubborn mule he'd once known, the sound that came from her throat was rusty and brief, but it was genuine, and the smile that followed lit up her entire face. Ethan found himself working harder to coax those smiles from her, to see that light in her eyes. One Sunday afternoon in May, with the work caught up and the day warm and beautiful, Ethan knocked on the kitchen door and gestured toward the hills. Clara looked puzzled until he mimed riding a horse, then pointed at her and then at himself. An invitation. Her eyes widened with surprise, but after a moment's hesitation, she nodded. They saddled 2 horses and rode out into the high desert, following a trail that wound up into the hills overlooking the valley. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all golden grass and gray-green sage, with the mountains rising blue in the distance. They rode for an hour before reaching a spot where a spring trickled from the rocks, creating a small oasis of cottonwood trees and green grass. Ethan dismounted and helped Clara down from her horse. She looked around at the hidden canyon with obvious delight, and he felt pleased that he'd thought to bring her here. They let the horses drink and graze while they sat on a flat rock in the dappled shade. "I used to come here when I was a boy," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "My family had a small ranch about 20 miles north of here before my folks passed from fever. This was always my favorite place, like the rest of the world couldn't touch you up here." Clara listened, her attention fully on him in a way that made his words come easier. "I spent years drifting after that," he continued, "working here and there, never staying anywhere too long. Figured I didn't have any reason to put down roots, but lately I've been thinking maybe it's time to stop running." He glanced at her and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Encouraged, he pressed on. "I know there's something weighing on you, Miss Colton, something that keeps you locked up inside yourself. I'm not asking you to tell me what it is, But I want you to know that whatever it is, it doesn't change how I see you. You're good and brave and beautiful, and I'd like to be someone you could lean on if you'd let me." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but these weren't tears of sadness. Her hand moved to her throat as if trying to physically pull words out, and the frustration on her face was painful to witness. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand again. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "I just needed you to know." She squeezed his hand tightly, then reached into her pocket with her free hand and pulled out a small pencil stub and a folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, she smoothed the paper on her knee and wrote carefully, "You make me want to try." Ethan read the words and felt something expand in his chest. "Then try," he said softly. "No pressure, no rush, but I'll be here, and you're safe with me." Clara nodded, fresh tears spilling over, and for the first time she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, holding her carefully as if she were something precious and fragile. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods and the soft sound of water over stone. When they rode back to the ranch that evening, something had shifted between them. The connection was no longer just partnership or friendship. It was something deeper, something that both frightened and thrilled Clara. That night, she lay in her bed and thought about Ethan's words, about the possibility of being safe enough to speak again, to tell the truth that had poisoned her silence. But the next morning, Thomas came home, and with him came trouble. He arrived with 3 other men, rough types who looked like they'd been living hard. They were loud and crude, tracking mud through the house, demanding food and whiskey. Thomas introduced them as friends from a mining camp in the hills, but Clara recognized the type. They were drifters, possibly outlaws, certainly dangerous. Ethan was repairing a water trough when he saw them arrive. Something about the way Clara's face went pale when she saw them set off warning bells in his mind. He finished his work quickly and made his way toward the house, arriving just as Clara was setting out cold meat and bread for the uninvited guests. One of the men, a stocky fellow with a scar across his cheek, grabbed Clara's wrist as she set down a plate. "Ain't you going to be more friendly? Pretty little thing like you, all silent and mysterious." Clara tried to pull away, but he held tight. Before Ethan could cross the room, Thomas laughed and said, "Leave her be, Ned. She's no fun anyway. Can't even talk." "That's so?" Ned said, leering. "Might be interesting to see what sounds she can make." Ethan's voice cut across the room like a whip. "Let her go, now." All eyes turned to him. Ned released Clara's wrist with a smirk, but didn't back down. "Who's this, Tommy?" "Your hired muscle?" "Just the ranch hand," Thomas said, his own eyes challenging Ethan. "And he'd do well to mind his own business." "Miss Colton's well-being is my business," Ethan said evenly. "Now, I don't know who your friends are, Thomas, but they're making your sister uncomfortable in her own home." Thomas stood up, swaying slightly. He'd clearly been drinking for hours already. "My sister? You mean the woman who let our father die? The woman who stood there and watched him bleed and didn't say a word to help him?" Clara's face drained of all color. She backed away from the table, shaking her head frantically. "That's what really happened, isn't it, Clara?" Thomas continued, his voice rising with cruel mockery. "You watched him die and you were glad. We all know it. The whole town knows it." "That's enough," Ethan said sharply, moving between Thomas and Clara. "Or what?" Thomas sneered. "You going to throw me off my own property? For telling the truth about my murdering sister?" "She didn't murder anyone," Ethan said firmly. "The marshal cleared her." "Only because I lied for her," Thomas spat, and suddenly the room went very quiet. Clara made a sound, a choked gasp that might have been a sob or might have been a word trying to form. Everyone looked at her. She was shaking violently, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Thomas laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "That's right, Clara. You kept quiet to protect me, but I'm done keeping your secrets. You want to know what really happened? Our father was a mean drunk. Everyone knew that. That night, he came home in a rage and started beating Clara, same as he'd done 100 times before. But this time, I'd had enough. I grabbed the fireplace poker and I hit him hard enough to crack his skull open. Clara tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. And she never said a word about it because she thought she was protecting me. The other men shifted uncomfortably. This was more family drama than they'd bargained for. But Thomas wasn't finished. What she doesn't know is that I'm glad I did it. Glad he's dead. And her keeping quiet didn't protect me. It just made her look guilty. Made the whole town think she was crazy or evil. And I let her take that on, let her suffer, because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. Clara collapsed to her knees on the floor, her body racked with silent sobs. Ethan immediately dropped beside her, his arm around her shoulders, but he kept his attention on Thomas. You let her take the blame, Ethan said, his voice low and hard with controlled anger. You let her carry that weight, let her lose her voice, let her become an outcast, all to save your own neck. Don't act so high and mighty, Thomas shot back. You don't know what it's like. He would have killed her eventually. I did what I had to do. Maybe, Ethan said, but then you let your sister pay the price. You've been drinking yourself stupid while she works herself to the bone trying to hold this place together. That makes you worse than a coward. That makes you cruel. Thomas's face flushed red with anger and shame. He looked like he might take a swing at Ethan, but one of his friends grabbed his arm. Come on, Tommy. Let's get out of here. This is getting too heavy. Thomas shook off his friend's hand but nodded. Fine. I'm done with this place anyway. Done with her guilty conscience and her silence. He looked at Clara with something that might have been regret, but looked more like resentment. You're free now, sister. The truth is out. You can talk or not talk. I don't care anymore. I'm leaving. He stumbled toward the door, his companions following. Within minutes they had ridden off, leaving dust hanging in the air and an awful silence in the house. Clara was still on the floor, crying with great shuddering breaths, but no sound. Ethan held her, murmuring reassurances until the storm of tears finally subsided. When she could breathe again, she pulled back and looked at him with red, swollen eyes. Her lips moved, forming a single word. Why? The sound was barely a whisper, rough and painful, the first word she'd spoken in 9 months, but Ethan heard it clearly. Why did he do it? Ethan asked gently. Or why did you protect him? Why? She whispered again. And this time he understood she meant everything. Why had her stepfather been so cruel? Why had Thomas let her suffer? Why had the world been so unfair? I don't know, Ethan admitted honestly. People do terrible things, sometimes out of fear or pain or weakness. But I know this. What you did, keeping silent to protect your brother, that was an act of love. It was misguided, maybe. It cost you too much, but it came from a good heart. You're not guilty of anything except caring too much about someone who didn't deserve it. He killed him, she whispered, her voice getting slightly stronger. But I wished him dead so many times. I prayed for it. Does that make me just as guilty? No, Ethan said firmly. Wishing someone would stop hurting you isn't the same as killing them. You were a victim, Clara, and you've been victimized twice over by being forced into silence. But you can break that silence now. You can speak your truth. She closed her eyes and more tears leaked out. I don't know how. I've been quiet so long, I don't remember how to have a voice. Start small, he suggested. Start with me. Tell me something. Anything. Clara opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the genuine care and patience in his face. She took a shaky breath and said, I was afraid. Every day I was so afraid. Of your stepfather? Of him, of the violence, of what would happen if I fought back or told anyone. He always said no one would believe me, that everyone would think I was the problem, and then when Thomas killed him, I was afraid they'd hang my brother if I told the truth. So I stayed quiet, and everyone thought I was crazy or guilty, and I let them think it because at least Thomas was safe. The words were coming faster now, tumbling out like water from a broken dam. Her voice was hoarse and raw, but she kept talking. But Thomas wasn't grateful. He was angry that I'd seen what he did, angry that I knew his secret, angry at the world. And he started drinking and wasting everything, and I couldn't say anything because I'd already given up so much to protect him. And then you came and you were kind to me, and you made me feel like maybe I wasn't broken after all. But I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd leave or you'd be disgusted by me. I could never be disgusted by you, Ethan said, his hand cupping her face gently. You're the strongest, bravest person I know. You survived hell and came out the other side still capable of kindness and hard work and hope. That's remarkable. Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. I don't feel strong. I feel tired. Then rest, he said. Let me help carry the weight for a while. She opened her eyes and searched his face. Why would you do that? You barely know me. I know enough, he said simply. I know that you're good and honest, and that you deserve better than what life has given you. I know that I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. And I know that I want to be the person you can lean on, the person who makes you feel safe. Safe, she repeated, as if testing the word. I haven't felt safe in years. You're safe now, he promised. With me, you're safe. Clara studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I believe you, she whispered. Ethan helped her to her feet, and they stood in the middle of the kitchen, still holding on to each other. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clara looked toward the window, then back at Ethan. What do I do now? She asked. Thomas is gone. The ranch is falling apart. The whole town thinks I'm either crazy or a murderess. How do I move forward from here? One step at a time, Ethan said. First, we get you settled for the night. Then tomorrow, we decide what comes next. But you don't have to decide anything right now. You've just broken years of silence. That's enough for today. She nodded gratefully, and he walked her to her room, making sure she was comfortable before returning to his own quarters in the barn. But neither of them slept much that night. Clara lay awake, her throat sore from speaking after so long, her mind churning with everything that had been said. She felt raw and exposed, as if a protective shell had been ripped away. But underneath the fear was a tiny seed of relief. The truth was out. The burden of secrets had been lifted, at least partially, and Ethan knew everything now, and he hadn't turned away. In the barn, Ethan stared at the ceiling beams and thought about Clara's pain-filled eyes and broken voice. He thought about the stepfather who had brutalized her, the brother who had betrayed her trust, the town that had judged her without knowing the truth. He thought about how brave she had been to endure it all in silence, misguided as that choice might have been. And he thought about how much he wanted to spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt that alone or frightened again. The next morning, Clara was up early as always, but when she emerged from the house, she walked straight to the barn where Ethan was feeding the horses. He looked up as she approached, his expression concerned. How are you feeling? He asked. Sore, she said, her voice still rough. My throat hurts from talking, but I'm all right. He smiled at the sound of her voice, even hoarse as it was. I'm glad you're talking. I like hearing your voice. She blushed slightly. I sound like a rusty gate. You sound like music, he countered, and the sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. They stood there for a moment, the morning sun slanting through the barn door, dust motes dancing in the light. Then Clara took a breath and said, I've been thinking about what to do, about the ranch, about everything. And I want to go to the marshal. I want to tell him the truth about what happened that night. I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting Thomas's lie define me. even if it means he gets in trouble, even if it means people judge me for keeping quiet all this time. I need to speak my truth." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's brave. But are you sure? Once you say it, you can't take it back." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I've lived in fear long enough, and you were right. My silence protected the people who hurt me most. My stepfather hurt me for years, and I stayed quiet because I was afraid. Thomas killed him, and then let me take the blame, and I stayed quiet to protect him. But neither of them deserved my protection. Neither of them earned my silence." "No, they didn't," Ethan agreed. "And I'll go with you if you want. You don't have to face this alone." Relief washed over her face. "I'd like that. Thank you." They rode into Quartz Hill together that afternoon. The town was busy with the usual daily activity: people shopping, horses and wagons moving along the main street, miners coming down from the hills to spend their wages. Clara felt people's eyes on her as they passed, heard the whispers start up in their wake, but with Ethan riding beside her, she kept her head up. Marshall Hendricks was in his office, reviewing paperwork, when they walked in. He looked up with surprise when he saw Clara, and even more surprise when she spoke. "Marshall, I need to tell you the truth about the night my stepfather died." Hendricks set down his pen slowly. "Miss Colton, I thought you couldn't speak." "I couldn't," she said. "Or maybe I wouldn't. But I can now, and I need to tell you what really happened." The marshal gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "All right, I'm listening." Clara sat down, Ethan standing supportively behind her chair, with his hand on her shoulder. She took a breath and began to speak. She told Hendricks everything: about the years of abuse from her stepfather, about how he'd come home drunk and violent that August night, about how Thomas had finally snapped and struck him with the fireplace poker, about how she'd tried to save him but couldn't, about how Thomas had begged her to say nothing and then lied to the marshal about what happened. "I kept quiet to protect my brother," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I thought if I stayed silent, he'd be safe. But my silence didn't protect anyone. It just hurt me. It made the town think I was guilty or crazy, and it let Thomas avoid facing what he'd done. I'm done protecting him. I'm telling you the truth now, and whatever comes of it, I can live with it." Marshall Hendricks sat back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "That's quite a story, Miss Colton, and it's different from what your brother told me back in August." "I know. He lied to protect himself." "I'm not lying. I'm telling you exactly what happened." "Where's Thomas now?" "He left yesterday with some men." "I don't know where he went, and honestly, I don't care." The marshal drummed his fingers on his desk. "You understand that if what you're saying is true, Thomas committed manslaughter at the very least. He could face serious charges." "I understand, but he did kill our stepfather." "Marshall, not me. And I'm tired of people thinking I did." Hendricks nodded slowly. "I believe you. I always thought there was something off about Thomas's story. Too convenient the way it laid out, and the way he behaved after. Drinking and carousing while you worked yourself to the bone, that didn't sit right with me either." He paused, then added, "I'll put out word for Thomas to be brought in for questioning. If what you say is true and I have no reason to doubt you, then he'll have to answer for what he did. It might go easier on him given the circumstances, the history of abuse, but that'll be for a judge and jury to decide." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "No, Miss Colton, thank you for having the courage to come forward. I know that couldn't have been easy." He glanced at Ethan. "Mr. Pierce, I assume you're involved in this how?" "I work for Miss Colton," Ethan said, "and I care about her. I wanted to support her in doing the right thing." "Good man." Hendricks stood and extended his hand to Clara. "I'll need you to sign a statement about what you told me, and there might be questions from the circuit judge when he comes through next month. But as far as I'm concerned, you're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing. You're a victim who's been protecting the real culprit, and that ends today." Clara shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "Thank you, Marshall." As they left the jailhouse, Clara felt dizzy, with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She'd done it. She'd spoken the truth, broken the silence that had imprisoned her for months. But now the whole town would know. The gossip would start up again, probably worse than before. People would judge her choices, question why she'd protected Thomas for so long. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan said quietly, "Let them talk. You know the truth now, and so does the law. That's what matters." They were walking their horses toward the edge of town when a woman's voice called out, "Clara! Clara Colton?" They turned to see Mrs. Morrison, the general store owner's wife, hurrying toward them. Clara tensed, expecting judgment or accusations, but when Mrs. Morrison reached them, her face was kind. "I heard you speaking just now, outside the marshal's office," the older woman said. "I'm so glad you found your voice again, dear. And I want you to know that not everyone in this town believed the worst of you. Some of us knew you'd been through something terrible, and we've been praying for you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. That means more than you know. Is it true what they're saying? That Thomas is the one who killed your stepfather?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, madam, he did. I kept quiet to protect him, but I can't do that anymore." Mrs. Morrison reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. "You're a good sister, maybe too good. But you deserve to live your life without that burden. Come by the store tomorrow. I've got some fabric I've been saving that would make a beautiful dress for you. Consider it a gift. I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "You've been through hell. Pardon my language. And you deserve a little kindness. Now, you take care of yourself and don't you worry about what people say. The truth has a way of setting things right." She patted Clara's hand once more and headed back to her store, leaving Clara staring after her in amazement. "See," Ethan said gently, "not everyone will judge you. Some people see the truth, see your strength." Clara turned to him, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she smiled genuinely, broadly, with real joy. "I think I'm going to be all right," she said, wonderingly. "I think everything might actually be all right." "I know it will be," Ethan said, and the look in his eyes made her heart beat faster. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one Clara had wrapped herself in for months. This was a peaceful quiet, the kind shared between two people who understood each other without needing constant words. When they reached the ranch, Ethan helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Clara," he said, and she loved the way her name sounded in his voice. "I know this has been a difficult time, and you're just starting to find your footing again. But I need you to know something." "What is it?" "I've fallen in love with you. I didn't mean to, didn't plan on it, but somewhere between fixing fences and watching you work through your pain with such courage, I fell completely in love with you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She searched his face and saw only honesty and tenderness there. "Ethan, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know you're not alone and you're loved, and I'll be here for as long as you'll have me." But Clara shook her head. "No, I want to say it. I love you too. I think I've been falling in love with you since the first day you looked at me like I was a person worth knowing instead of a curiosity or a burden. You've been patient and kind and strong when I needed strength. You've helped me find my voice again, Ethan. You've helped me remember who I am underneath all the fear and silence." Ethan's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger. "Yeah? Yeah," she said, smiling back through happy tears. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and sweet and gentle. Clara melted into the kiss, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling safe and cherished and alive in a way she hadn't in years. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she laughed out loud, a sound of pure joy. "What's funny?" Ethan asked, grinning. Nothing's funny. Everything's wonderful. I'm happy. I haven't been happy in so long I'd forgotten what it felt like. Then I'm going to make it my life's mission to keep you happy, he promised. They walked to the house hand in hand, and for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was walking into a prison of memories. With Ethan beside her, the house was just a house, and the future was just beginning. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Clara continued to work the ranch, but now Ethan worked alongside her as a true partner rather than a hired hand. They talked for hours in the evenings, making up for all the months she'd been silent. She told him about her childhood before her mother married the man who would become such a nightmare, about her dreams of having a real family someday, about the small joys she found in working the land. He told her about his own losses and struggles, about the loneliness of years spent drifting, about how finding her had felt like finding home. The town's attitude toward Clara shifted as the truth of what had happened spread. Some people were sympathetic, understanding that she'd been caught in an impossible situation. Others were critical of her choice to protect Thomas, but even they couldn't deny that she'd suffered for it. Marshal Hendricks put out a warrant for Thomas's arrest, but word came back that he'd left California entirely, heading east, perhaps to try to disappear in the territories. Clara felt a pang of sadness for the brother she'd once loved, but mostly she felt relief that he was gone and couldn't hurt her anymore. Mrs. Morrison made good on her promise of the fabric, and Clara spent several evenings sewing a new dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out the green in her eyes. When she wore it to church the following Sunday, Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. After the service, several townspeople approached her to welcome her back into the community, to tell her they were glad she was speaking again. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a start. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills, Ethan took Clara's hand and said, "I've been thinking about the future." "Have you?" she asked, lacing her fingers through his. "I have. This ranch needs a lot of work to be truly profitable again. But with both of us working together, I think we could build something good here. Expand the herd, maybe plant some crops in the bottomland near the creek. It would take time and effort, but I think we could make a real success of it." "We?" Clara asked, her heart starting to beat faster. "We," he confirmed, turning to face her. "Clara Colton, I know we haven't been courting long by traditional standards, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build this ranch with you, build a family with you, build a future where you never have to be afraid or silent or alone again. Will you marry me?" Clara felt tears spill over, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you, Ethan Pierce, and I can't imagine my life without you." He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, a ring that had belonged to his mother, and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her deeply, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be, with this man building this life. They were married in August, exactly 1 year after the night that had changed Clara's life forever. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in Quartz Hill with Marshal Hendricks and Mrs. Morrison standing as witnesses. Clara wore the blue dress and wildflowers in her hair, and Ethan wore his best suit, his eyes never leaving her face as they exchanged vows. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only supportive silence. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of friends and neighbors applauded warmly. Clara looked out at the faces and saw acceptance and happiness for her, and she realized that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her whole life, a place where she belonged, people who cared about her, and a man who loved her unconditionally. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food prepared by neighboring women who'd taken Clara under their collective wing. There was music and dancing, laughter and joy. When Ethan led Clara in their first dance as husband and wife, she remembered the silent, frightened woman she'd been just months before and marveled at the transformation. She'd found her voice, and in doing so, she'd found herself. As the sun set and guests began to leave, offering congratulations and well wishes, Clara and Ethan stood together on their porch, watching the last golden light fade from the sky. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. Happy? He murmured into her hair. Happier than I ever thought possible, she said. Thank you for helping me break my silence. Thank you for making me feel safe. Always, he promised. For the rest of our lives, you're safe with me. That night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bed, Clara thought about all the paths that had led her to this moment, the pain and fear, the betrayal and loss, even the terrible silence. All of it had brought her here, to this man, to this love, to this new beginning. She wouldn't have chosen the journey, but she was grateful for the destination. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch prospered under their joint care. The herds grew, and the land yielded good crops. They hired additional hands when the work grew beyond what two people could manage, and Clara found she had a talent for managing the business side of ranching, keeping careful accounts and negotiating fair prices for their cattle and produce. In the spring of 1884, Clara gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy they named James, after Ethan's father. Holding her son for the first time, Clara wept with joy and relief. This child would never know the kind of fear she'd grown up with. He would be raised in a home full of love and safety, with parents who would protect him and encourage him to always speak his truth. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Mary, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's easy smile. And then 3 years after that, another son, Daniel, who was stubborn and curious and kept them both on their toes. The house that had once been a place of pain and silence became filled with the sounds of children laughing, of family dinners around a crowded table, of bedtime stories and lullabies. Clara sang to her children every night, her voice getting stronger with each passing year, reclaiming all the words she'd once held captive inside herself. Thomas never returned to California. Clara heard through occasional letters forwarded by the marshal that he'd settled somewhere in Colorado, working in the silver mines. He never apologized for what he'd put her through, but she found she didn't need his apology anymore. She'd built a life so full and good that his absence was barely noticeable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Clara with a picnic at the Spring in the Hills, the place where he'd first told her she was safe with him. They left the children with a neighbor and rode out together, just the two of them, retracing the path they'd taken that day so long ago. The cottonwoods were bigger now. The spring still flowed clear and cold, and the view was just as beautiful as she remembered. They spread a blanket on the flat rock and shared bread and cheese and wine, talking and laughing as the afternoon sun warmed them. "Do you ever think about that day?" Ethan asked, "the first time I brought you here?" "I think about it often," Clara said. "It was the day I started to believe I might be able to speak again, to trust again. You gave me that gift." "You gave it to yourself," he corrected gently. "I just provided a safe place for you to do the hard work." "We gave it to each other then," she compromised, smiling. "Everything good in my life I share with you." "And I with you," he said, pulling her close. "When I rode into Quartz Hill all those years ago, I was just looking for work. I never imagined I'd find the love of my life, that I'd build a family and a home and a future beyond anything I'd dreamed of." "I never imagined I'd be happy," Clara admitted. "For so long, I thought happiness was something other people got to have, not me. But you proved me wrong. You loved me when I couldn't speak, when I was broken and scared, and you helped me piece myself back together." "You were never broken," Ethan insisted. "Wounded, yes. Silent, yes, but never broken. Your strength is what drew me to you in the first place." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind and the water, holding each other as they'd done so many times before. Then Clara said softly, "I'm pregnant again." Ethan pulled back to look at her, his eyes wide with surprise and delight. "Really? Really? I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be sure before I told you. The midwife confirmed it yesterday. He let out a whoop of joy and spun her around, both of them laughing. Another baby! Clara, that's wonderful. I think it might be twins, she added, smiling at his expression. I'm bigger than I was at this stage with the others, and I've been feeling twice as tired. Twins, he repeated, sounding awed. Two more blessings. How did I get so lucky? We're both lucky, she said, kissing him. We found each other when we both needed finding. We built something beautiful out of pain and silence. And now we get to keep building, keep growing, keep loving. That fall, Clara's intuition proved correct. She gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Rose, who were identical except for a small birthmark on Emma's left shoulder. The older children adored their new sisters, and the house grew even more chaotic and joyful. As the years passed and the children grew, Clara made sure to teach them the lessons she'd learned through such hard experience. She taught them that silence in the face of injustice or abuse only helps the abuser. She taught them that speaking truth, even when it's difficult or scary, is always better than living a lie. She taught them that real love means creating safety for each other, not demanding silence or compliance. And she taught them by example, living her life loudly and authentically, never again hiding her voice or her truth. She became known throughout the county as a woman of integrity and strength, someone who had survived terrible circumstances and come out the other side, not bitter, but compassionate, not broken, but whole. Ethan watched his wife blossom over the years, becoming more confident and self-assured with each passing season. He never took credit for her transformation, knowing that the strength had always been within her, but he was proud to have been the person who helped her see it in herself, and he counted himself blessed every single day that she'd chosen to build her life with him. On their 20th anniversary, their children, now ranging from teenagers to young adults, threw them a celebration party. Friends and neighbors from all over the region came to the ranch to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and an overwhelming sense of love and goodwill. Late in the evening, as the party wound down and guests began departing, Clara stood with Ethan under the stars in the yard where she'd once run to cry in silent desperation. She thought about that woman, the one who couldn't speak, who thought she had to carry every burden alone, who believed she deserved her suffering, and she marveled at how far she'd come. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, his arm around her waist. "I'm thinking about silence and voice," Clara said, "about how my silence protected the people who hurt me most. My stepfather, because I didn't speak up about the abuse. Thomas, because I didn't tell the truth about what he'd done. Even myself, because I silenced my own needs and pain for so long. And now? Now I use my voice for good. I speak up for myself and for others who can't speak for themselves. I tell our children the truth, even when it's complicated. I sing and laugh and cry and yell when I need to. And I'm so grateful to you for helping me find that voice again." "You would have found it eventually," Ethan said. "You're too strong to stay silent forever." "Maybe," Clara allowed. "But you made me feel safe enough to try. You gave me the space and support I needed to break free, and that made all the difference." Their oldest son, James, now 17, and already taller than his father, approached them with a shy smile. "Ma, Pa, I wanted to tell you something." "What is it, son?" Ethan asked. "I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life. I know you both expect me to take over the ranch eventually, and I'm honored by that. But I've been talking to Marshal Hendricks, and he thinks I'd make a good lawman. I want to help people, want to make sure justice is done right. Would you be disappointed if I chose that path instead?" Clara and Ethan exchanged glances, and Clara smiled. "Disappointed? James, we want you to follow your heart and use your talents in whatever way feels right to you. If you want to be a lawman, we'll support you completely." Relief flooded James's face. "Really? I was worried you'd be upset about the ranch." The ranch will be fine, Ethan assured him. Your sisters and brothers will find their own paths too, and we'll figure out what makes sense when the time comes. What matters is that you're doing what you believe in. James hugged them both tightly. Thank you. I promise I'll make you proud. You already do, Clara said. Clara, her voice thick with emotion. Every single day. As their son walked away to rejoin his siblings, Ethan turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. He's going to be great at that, standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. He learned from the best, Clara said, squeezing his hand. He learned from watching his father treat everyone with respect and fairness. He learned from hearing his mother's story about finding the courage to speak truth even when it's hard. We've built something good here, Ethan said, looking around at the ranch, at the house full of light and laughter, at the children they'd raised together. Not just the property or the business, but a family. A real, loving, honest family. The kind of family I always dreamed of, Clara agreed. The kind where everyone is safe to be themselves, where truth is valued more than appearance, where love is shown through action every day. They stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of beauty and meaning from the ashes of trauma and silence. And as the last of the guests departed and their children began cleaning up from the party, Clara thought about how lucky she was, how far she'd come, how completely her life had transformed. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time brings. The children grew up and began their own lives. James did become a marshal, serving with distinction in a neighboring county. Mary married a kind school teacher and moved to San Francisco, where she opened a school for girls from difficult circumstances. Daniel took over the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for breeding horses. The twins, Emma and Rose, both studied nursing and opened a clinic in Quartz Hill that served the mining families in the hills. Clara and Ethan grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love deepening with each passing year. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set, content in the life they'd built. One evening, when they were both in their early 60s, Clara said softly, "I need to tell you something." Ethan looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "Don't worry, it's nothing bad. I've just been thinking about writing down my story. Not for publication or anything like that, but for our grandchildren. I want them to know where they came from, what their grandmother survived and overcame. I want them to understand the importance of speaking truth and breaking harmful silences." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Ethan said. "Your story could help people, Clara. It could give hope to women in similar situations, show them that silence isn't the only option, that there's a way forward." "Maybe," Clara said thoughtfully. "Or maybe it'll just be a family record, a way for future generations to know us. Either way, I want to write it while I still remember everything clearly." She spent the next several months working on her memoir, writing for a few hours each day, pausing often to remember and reflect. Ethan would find her at the kitchen table with papers spread around her, chewing on her pencil as she searched for the right words. Sometimes she cried as she wrote, reliving the painful parts. Sometimes she smiled, remembering the joy of falling in love, of finding her voice, of building her family. When she finally finished, she had a thick stack of pages covered in her neat handwriting. She read the whole thing aloud to Ethan one winter evening, and when she finished, they both sat in silence for a long moment. "That's powerful," Ethan finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've captured everything. The pain, the struggle, the hope, the love. I'm honored to be part of your story." "You're not just part of it," Clara said, reaching for his hand. "You're the reason there's a happy ending. You're the reason I found my voice and my strength. This story is as much yours as mine." They decided to have several copies made of the memoir, one for each of their children, and a few for the grandchildren when they were old enough to understand. Clara also gave a copy to Mrs. Morrison, who had remained a dear friend through the decades. The older woman read it with tears streaming down her face, then hugged Clara tightly. "This is a gift," she said. not just to your family, but to any woman who's ever felt trapped by silence or fear. You've shown that there's always a way forward, always hope for a better future. As Clara entered her 70s, her health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down that comes with age. But she faced it with the same courage she'd faced everything else, never complaining, always grateful for each day she had with her beloved husband and her sprawling family. On a warm spring evening, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Clara sat in her favorite chair on the porch and looked out at the ranch she'd helped build. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the hills in golden light. Ethan sat beside her, his hand clasped in hers as it had been for more than 40 years. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Clara said softly. "All of this, the land, the family, the life we've built together. More beautiful than I ever imagined possible," Ethan agreed. "You've given me everything, Clara. Purpose, love, family, home. You've made me the happiest man alive. And you gave me my voice," she said, squeezing his hand. "You gave me the safety and courage to break my silence. You showed me what real love looks like. Every good thing in my life flows from that gift you gave me." Their oldest grandson, a bright boy of 12 named after Ethan, approached them shyly. "Grandma, will you tell us a story?" Clara smiled at the request, as she always did. "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "Tell us about when you and Grandpa first met, about how he helped you when you were scared and couldn't talk. That's my favorite story." Clara and Ethan exchanged warm glances, and she nodded. "All right, but this is a long story, so everyone gather around and get comfortable." The family settled on the porch and in the yard, children and grandchildren alike, all eager to hear the story they'd heard many times before, but never tired of. Clara's voice, still strong despite her years, carried clearly in the evening air. "It was the summer of 1882, in a little town called Quartz Hill," she began, "and I was living in a silence that I thought would last forever. I'd forgotten what my own voice sounded like. I'd forgotten that I had any power at all. But then a cowboy rode into town, looking for honest work, and everything changed." She told the story with all its pain and beauty, the hardship and the hope, the silence and the breaking of that silence. She didn't hide the difficult parts or gloss over the trauma. She wanted her grandchildren to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That love isn't just a feeling, but a choice made new each day. That speaking truth, especially when it's hard, is always worth the cost. By the time she finished, the sun had set completely and stars filled the sky. Several of the grandchildren had fallen asleep in their parents' arms, but the older ones sat with wide eyes, absorbing the lessons woven through the story. "Grandma," her granddaughter Emma asked, "do you still think about those days? Does it still make you sad?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I remember them, yes, but they don't make me sad anymore. They make me grateful. Grateful that I survived, grateful that I found the courage to break my silence, and grateful beyond measure that I found your grandfather. Those hard times made me who I am, taught me what I needed to know to build this beautiful life. So no, I'm not sad. I'm thankful." As the family began preparing to leave for their own homes, Clara remained in her chair, feeling the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She had broken her silence all those years ago, had spoken truth and found love, and the ripples of those choices extended far beyond herself. Her children and grandchildren would carry those lessons forward, would remember the importance of voice and truth and courage. Ethan helped her inside when everyone had gone, supporting her with the same gentle strength he'd always shown. As they prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routines of a long marriage, Clara felt overwhelmingly blessed. "Thank you," she said suddenly, and Ethan looked at her with surprise. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. For hearing me when I had no voice. For loving me when I didn't know how to love myself. For building this life with me. for every day, every moment, every kindness. Thank you. Ethan pulled her close, holding her in the embrace that had been her safe harbor for more than 4 decades. Thank you for letting me love you, for trusting me enough to break your silence, for choosing me, choosing us, choosing this life. You've made every day an adventure and a blessing. They fell asleep that night, as they did every night, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. Clara's last thought before drifting off was of gratitude for all of it, the pain that taught her resilience, the silence that taught her the value of voice, the cowboy who taught her what love truly meant, and the life they'd built together from courage and hope and unshakable faith in each other. And so the story that began with silence and fear ended with love and joy and a legacy that would echo through generations. Clara had broken the silence that protected those who hurt her, had found her voice with the help of a cowboy who made her feel safe, and in doing so, had created a life of beauty and meaning that touched everyone around her. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth celebrating. And most of all, it was a story with a truly happy ending, the kind that comes from choosing courage over comfort, truth over silence, and love over fear. The ranch continued thriving under Daniel's care, the family continued growing with new marriages and new babies, and the memory of Clara and Ethan's great love story continued inspiring everyone who heard it to be braver, kinder, and more honest in their own lives.